Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Paula, and thanks to Palanpur Samaj. Uh, it's always a tough act to follow Ganesh, and now with Sandeep's context and with Paula covering pretty much everything, I'm left with very little to say. So let me try to touch upon a few of my observations in entrepreneurship and some of the lessons and experiences that I've had along the way. But first, Paul, I must say, you're very, very resourceful. Anybody who knows me knows that I would never get out on a Sunday morning for a panel or for a talk. So Paula did the classic Indian thing. She called my sister up, and when a sister calls in India, when your sister calls you and says, "Anupam, you have to do this for me," on Sunday morning, you can't say no. So Paula, well done. But I want to start with a very interesting word in entrepreneurship that we use. It's called vision, and a lot of people, investors, a lot of people often use the word very loosely, and they ask entrepreneurs a lot about what is your vision. So I want to relate my experience with starting Shaadi.com and vision. In a nutshell, it's all bullshit, right? Vision is best fitted retroactively, right? You ask somebody who's created a business worth $10 billion, and a lot of times they forget the reality and get into how they had this grand vision of changing the world, and that's how they sort of started the business. My experience is slightly different. I find that a lot of entrepreneurs, especially here in India, are accidental entrepreneurs. And mine is a very similar case. So I was studying in the US, and I happened to be in India for a couple of months, and I was bored and was thinking about the consumer internet because it's very influenced by what was happening in the mid-90s in the US, with Netscape being the first company, I think, that went public and really made a lot of us stand up and say, what is this internet thing? And so I was very, very, aware of what was going on. I was here for a few months and bored and sitting at my dad's office, who, by the way, was a businessman who manufactured fabrics. And a friend of his happened to come into the office, and he said, "I've got a friend to come and visit you." And this friend actually turned out to be a matchmaker, right? And my dad didn't want to face my wrath, so he just posed him as a friend. And this guy was actually trying to find me a match. So he came in and he started interviewing me about these various aspects about my education and so on and so forth. And pretty soon I figured out what he was trying to do. But it seemed really limiting that the choice of my matches was limited by the amount of weight this man could carry in his bag, right? He could carry about 50 biodatas, and he knew about 100 families, and that was my extent of options. And that seemed very unnerving to me. So, I turned him away politely, but an idea had occurred that what if we took away the geographical and the spatial limitations? Then nobody would be limited by their choice of matches. Just like the guy from Bihar could buy shoes for 3,500, now he could potentially get married to somebody from the US. So, jokes apart, that was the germ of the idea. And, I started the site, hired 5 engineers and 4 designers. Those days, by the way, and this was mid-90s, an engineer cost about 7,000 rupees to hire, and a designer cost about 5,000 rupees. So it didn't matter, right? I was making a 6-figure salary in the US, and so this made perfect sense. Hired a team of 7-8 people, and we just kept experimenting for the next 5 years. 2000 is when the dot-com went completely bust, and the internet was a very, very bad place to be. And that was the time we actually started to see some very strong indications on our site. Suddenly there were people coming in, people from the US, especially because they had internet access much more than Indians did, and also because their need was a lot higher because they were essentially geographically dislocated from India. So we started to see a lot of indication of things happening. And, if you actually pull back and you think about it, as people, we always overestimate the impact that technological change will have in the short term, but underestimate it in the long term, right? And just when people said, "Oh my God, this was all a bubble, this is all bullshit," and went their way and stopped looking at the internet, the beginnings of the undercurrents were so strong that the beginnings of the real internet economy was taking place. Google, for example, was during this time that really started to create value. So with us as well, we started to see some indicators. And 2001 is when full-time I started working on Shaadi.com, and one thing led to another. Along the way, we launched Makaan.com and Moj Mobile, and today, combined, we're about close to 300 crores in revenue, which is pretty good given the size of our internet economy in this country. Along the way, I also, and this is something that most entrepreneurs face, their blessing is their curse. The opportunistic mindset is a blessing, but that also leads you to a lack of focus and you start doing multiple things. And so at some point, I realized that was not going to work, and so I started angel investing. Today, I've done several investments, but the point I wanted to share with you guys is since I've been investing about 6 or 7 years now, my internal rate of return is a lot more than 100%. And the only reason I bring this up is because I don't know any other business or any other industry that can provide that kind of rate of return. So something real is happening, right? Something real is happening. Real companies are being built, and real exits are happening. So that's one point. The second point I wanted to make was besides the things that Ganesh and Sandeep have been talking about, the other shift that we've seen in the last, I'd say, 20 years in this country is a shift from a supply-constrained economy to one that is now driving value based on consumer obsession. When it comes to the internet and digital businesses, consumer obsession is the altar that one has to worship at. I remember as a kid growing up, I used to hear my dad talk about fabrics, and he did a lot of phone calls from home. And all they ever spoke about was inventory and when the payments would come in, right? So we used to hear these loud conversations about, and I'm not going to use some of the words he used, but when are you going to send the payment in, right? I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Now, years later, I would think back and say, wow, how come I never heard him talk about what does the consumer actually want? And the reason was simple. It was so supply constrained that they didn't need to. But that's changed, and that's changed dramatically. I'm not going to get too much into it because I think we have limited time, and Sandeep touched upon some of these facts. But enough to say that the internet puts consumers at the corner of the center of the world, and that's because everything else is a click away. So one better be obsessed with what consumers need and to understand them based on analytics and observation. I think the other observation, a lot of times I'm asked about what does it take to build a successful internet company? And, when you look around, it would seem that it's technology. A lot of times you read about a certain company raising $100 million and you think it's capital. But, if you dig a little deeper, it seems to me that more important than technology and capital, what really matters in building great, valuable internet companies is speed, talent, and culture, right? And I think if you have those nailed down, everything else starts to take care of itself. Great talent, comes up with great ideas. Great culture perseveres, focuses on the right things. And speed gives you the added advantage that you need to compete in a hyper-competitive economy. What we see typically, and the culture is a reflection of, typically you see one or two restless entrepreneurs who are long-term greedy and have the smarts and perseverance to see things through. And I think that's sort of, where everything else flows from. So besides, consumer obsession and speed, talent, culture, what we also find, and this is specific more to India, what we see, or in my experience, a lot of times in India, one has to build the ecosystem. So what we take for granted in the US, that deliveries will happen on time, payments will work as they should. A lot of times in India, these things simply aren't there. So as we know with Flipkart, or as we know with several other companies, not only are they building the sort of goods and services, inventory and market. They also have to build out the logistics. One of the companies that I'm invested in called Ola Cabs. Now I know the amount of work that goes in the West. You could easily just take for granted that there are drivers available and cars available. Here they actually have to arrange for financing for these cars, train people to become drivers and become entrepreneurs, and therefore build the entire ecosystem. So as you look at entrepreneurship across India, and you spot opportunities to build stuff, don't forget to think about all the enablers of that opportunity and whether it's in place, and if not, how will you help to put it in place? Because without that, it's very hard to build a business in India. In our own experience with Shadi.com, we actually had to go out and build about 60 or 70 Shadi centers to educate people and parents and so on about how this actually works, because nobody could believe that you could find a life partner on a website, right? So it's very important to think about the ecosystem. How much time do we have? Almost done?
We'll keep some for the quick Q&A.
Okay, so let me try to then wrap up. Let's see. Yeah, I think those are just some of the thoughts. And I'll just leave you guys with a couple of points, right? I was going to talk a little bit about valuation and so on, but I think Sandeep did that very well. The only one thing that I wanted to add to what Sandeep was saying, besides sort of the scalability that these companies demonstrate that have 400, 500, $100 billion market caps, the big difference between these companies and traditional businesses are the network effects that they have. And by that, what I mean is, let's take Google, for example. Every time more people search on Google, that many more websites want to get indexed by Google. The more websites that are indexed by Google, the more people search on Google. So it creates such an incredible network effect. Take Facebook. The only reason you're there is because your friends are there. The more of your friends are there, the more people are there, and so on and so forth. And these network effects pretty much make it impossible for anybody else to do the same business, right? And that's kind of what's reflected in the valuations. I think, last point, probably the best way if you're early on and thinking about, how do you understand the space even better, I think the best way to do it is to put your money where your ears are, in this case, and probably start, look at joining an angel network. Take a few lakhs as play money. I'm sure that's play money to a lot of you guys. Perhaps I should say crores in your case, and actually go and make a few investments. I think that's perhaps the best education that you can have in this space. So I guess with that said, thank you.
Great.